Welcome to the Flip Your Script podcast. I'm Kristi Piehl. Today's topic is one our avid listeners know I'm passionate about, and I've wanted to focus an episode on the media landscape, media bias for a while, but honestly, I couldn't figure out a way to do it and keep it interesting. Then someone on my team introduced me to the work of Isaac Saul. Isaac is the founder of Tangle, which is an independent, ad-free, non-partisan politics newsletter that offers both sides of the biggest news stories. And when I say something like independent, ad-free, nonpartisan politics, you're probably thinking, that's impossible. No way can someone do politics in an unpartisan, unbiased way. Isaac, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me on. I'm super glad to be here.
What you've tried to do is something that many people say it's impossible, and you're disrupting media in a few different ways. Politics, nonpartisan. The whole world seems to have shifted to go further down the partisan, further down the bias kind of path. And also, you started up a media thing in a time when many media outlets, big ones, are shutting down or turning off different parts of their business because they can't figure out how to make money. And here you show up on the scene and you've got a huge following. So first of all, congratulations. It's remarkable that you've been able to do it. And it's so brave also. But I want to start with why. Why did you think, okay, I'm a passionate journalist. I think I can disrupt this whole thing and do something meaningful. Why did you do it?
Well, first of all, I'll just say that I was not sure that it was going to work when I started. I think, a lot of people have brilliant $1 million ideas for a business or a startup or a product, and they basically put it to market, and there's clearly a desire for it, and they're confident in from the start. They've kind of unlocked something new. I was doing something where in the beginning, I created Tangle because it was a product I wanted that I couldn't find anywhere. And that's sort of like the entrepreneurial 101 is if you want something and it doesn't exist, there's probably a lot of other people out there who also want it as well. But I was still not confident that there was a big enough audience to support, a newsroom or a team or even myself alone writing a newsletter. So I was very unsure. I don't want to give the misconception that I was like, this is the right time, the perfect moment. Basically, every signal was that it was the terrible time and the worst moment, and nobody was going to be interested in this. So it was kind of a leap of faith, to be honest, in the country, in where we were in terms of our political divides, just the sense that I felt like we had hit rock bottom. And there had to be other people out there who are really feeling that way and wanted something different than the current diet they were getting. So, for me, that was the big thing was I was reading the news. It was Donald Trump's rise, 2019. He had been in office for a few years and he was seemingly going to get reelected. And nobody was talking to each other anymore. Everybody had gone into their corners and been fighting and the silos. And a story would come out about, his administration, something he had done. And in order to get an idea of the full breadth of the arguments and the views about that story, say Donald Trump's proposed border wall, I would have to read the New York Times and then read the Wall Street Journal and then watch Fox News and then watch CNN and then listen to a couple of conservative podcasts and listen to a couple of liberal podcasts and then go on YouTube and then go on Twitter. And, 12 hours later, I would feel like, okay, I have a really good grasp now of the different arguments about this issue from across the political spectrum. But there was no one place I could just go get that. And so I wanted to build one place where you could just go get that. And, most Americans aren't professional journalists like I am, so they don't have 12 hours to commit to something like that. They have 10 or 15 minutes. And that was kind of part two, was turning that project into something people could consume in 10 or 15 minutes.
Is it hard for you to park your own thoughts on an issue? Because that's the thing that people say, this is the problem with journalism. I mean, I was a journalist for 12 years. Like, I love the profession and I've got all sorts of thoughts about why we are where we are and why people hate journalists. But how do you do it? Because you are also a human being who votes and who is politically interested. How do you approach something and take in things that you probably believe are flawed, wrong, biased and say, I'm going to look at this with one lens, and then I'm going to present it in a way to my audience that removes or minimizes that lens?
So, first of all, I think part of the advantage that we have is our format in the daily newsletter and the daily podcast. And that's kind of our special sauce. So, for your listeners who aren't familiar with our work, I mean, today we wrote about the death of Iran's president in our newsletter. So, the way we cover a story like that is we explain in the most neutral language possible what just happened. So, this is just as bare bones as we can make it, the facts of the story, some of the different angles that people are presenting about the story, the dominant narratives around it, and just like the general information people need and some explanations about, who this president was, how he rose to power, that kind of thing. And then we share a bunch of perspectives from the left and a bunch of perspectives from the right. And in this case, because this was an international story, we shared a couple opinion pieces from Iranian writers. And so we're taking those op-eds, or we're taking, podcast bits or YouTube videos or monologues, and we're turning them into little bite-sized things to kind of give people just a wide range of views about the issue. And then at the end, we have my take, which is basically a section for me to just say, this is how I feel about the issue. And I think it does a couple of things for our readers. First of all, the reason my take exists is not because I'm trying to convince people what they should think one way or the other. Sometimes I feel really strongly about an issue and I tell readers that, and I certainly try and be persuasive. But more than anything else, it's an act of transparency. It's saying, I know that there's a person behind this piece of news, and you want to know what my leanings are. You want to know where I'm coming from on this issue. So, if I'm covering the death of the Iranian president, I am an American Jew who's lived in Israel, who understands, the security threat Iran poses to Israel. So I'm going to talk about it in my take through that lens. And I'm going to tell our readers, this is a bias that I have about this issue, is I don't think this guy's a good dude. And that's just my honest truth that I'm bringing to the table. But I compartmentalize it. I put it in this one little space, and it gives me kind of my outlet. And in the first few newsletters I sent, when it was like, 15 people I was sending my email to, the response I got from people before the My Take section existed was, I want to know what you think. Like, what's your opinion? Like, we do the intro, I tell you what the left's saying, I tell you what the right's saying, and then it's like we have some other news bits and the whole thing's kind of over. And the overwhelming response was people writing in and saying, this would be way more interesting if you shared your view. Like, I don't care whether I agree. I'm just curious, how you think about it. So we started doing that. And now today we know that that's a really popular section. And if people disagree, it gives them somebody to yell at, which is me. And that makes them feel better that they have a person they can talk to and communicate with. And it gives me an outlet to just be honest about how I feel.
And I love this about your newsletter. I also love that you say when you got it wrong, because I've seen a couple of times where you're like, hey, turns out I got it wrong. And you don't put that in like the teeny tiny print buried in the like little section at the bottom. You're like, first thing, hey, we got it wrong, or the new information or whatever. It's so transparent. And I think that's one of the things that has just diminished, is this transparency, because my own perspective is that the whole media landscape got screwed up sometime in probably the 80s or 90s when opinion shows, television particularly, television shows that were opinion looked like news. And the public then couldn't quite tell, is this someone's opinion? Is this news? And then now because I really encourage everyone to watch exactly what you said, MSNBC, Fox, get that on your feed, compare, look at it, just see what half the world is thinking that's the opposite than you. But people have such a hard time of distinguishing from fact and fiction. And if more journalists were to say, hey, here's all the stuff that isn't biased, here's what is biased, and here's what I think, boy, I think we could have better conversations about things, because we're not trying to hide behind some veil of bias that is actual bias.
Yeah, I mean, this is sort of, one of the sticking points that I have that I always talk about is, no journalist out there is quote unquote unbiased or nonpartisan or whatever. Everybody has personal experiences that influence the way they view the world. If you're a reporter and you're deeply familiar with, Congress or immigration or climate change, you're talking all day to experts. You're totally immersed in these beats that you cover. You come out of that feeling like you have a view about it. Like, I know a ton of people in the media. I've been a journalist for 10 years. None of them are like quiet or, shy about their opinions in private. They all feel really strongly about certain issues. There's a difference between a journalist who has, opinion and then uses that opinion to kind of bias the way they cover stories. We call those people hacks. Like, they are people who are intentionally taking an angle on a story and pursuing a truth in the beginning before they get done reporting the story. They come into it with an agenda. But there are a lot of reporters who have really strong feelings about stuff that are just fair reporters, and they can go do their job and, put their opinions to the side for a minute and tell people honestly what just happened, even if it pains them to report the story they're reporting. I mean, one of the famous examples that I talk about all the time that people have kind of memory hold is, like, the New York Times now has a reputation for being left. It's always had a reputation for being left leaning, left of center politically. They always endorse Democrats for president. And yet, the New York Times has done most of the most damaging reporting on every Democratic politician in America for the last 20 years. The New York Times was the publication that originally reported on Hillary Clinton's email server, which pretty much ended her entire political career. And now, today, that story has been kind of co opted by a lot of people in the conservative media. And so we forget that it was actually a team of the quote unquote biased New York Times reporters who broke that story, who, I'm sure for them, it was, some of them probably wanted Hillary Clinton to get elected, but they went and did their jobs and they reported a really tough story on her because that's what a lot of journalists do. So it's not about, people being unbiased or whatever. It's about people being fair and transparent and, treating a story in the with the idea that they just want to communicate the best information possible to people. And I think a lot of reporters are still doing that, and a lot of reporters obviously are not.
And it's such a important point because I've said this to people who know my background, who have come up to me, social circles, whatever, who believe that the last election, was fraudulent. And the media is all in on it, right? All the media is in on this kind of fraudulent narrative. And what I always say to them is, if that was true, that would be the biggest story that any journalist could report. And if a journalist could report that story with fact, they would be sitting on a Pulitzer. I mean, it would be the biggest story that anyone could break. And there's thousands of journalists in the world looking for big stories. So to some degree, we have to apply this common sense, which is exactly what I think the dumbing down of how people can consume media has done, is that we sort of take it all in without asking questions, or because people don't have 12, like you said, people don't have 12 hours to look at 25 different angles on a story. And Tangle is certainly a fix to that. Are there other things that you'd like to see entered into the American conversation so that when we go through the summer and fall we're about to get into with this divisive, polarized 50-50 sort of environment, we could have healthier conversations?
Yeah, I mean, look, my advice to people is always that the easiest and lowest friction way to kind of be part of the solution, not part of the problem, is to deal with it in your community that is, immediate to you. I don't think that spending your time trying to have helpful dialogue on Facebook or in Twitter comments is necessarily a good use of your time, to be totally frank. I think a much better use of your time is, you have a neighbor who's a diehard Joe Biden supporter and you're a big Trump supporter. It's knocking on his door with a six pack of beer and just asking to spend time together talking. And it sounds really cheesy, but I can tell you that it is by far, in my view and from my personal experience, the most effective way to communicate with people or to have helpful conversations with people who you really strongly disagree with. One of the core parts of my Genesis story and why I do the work that I do is that I grew up in Bucks County, Pennsylvania, which is one of the most divided counties in America. It's a bellwether county in a bellwether state. Up until recently, Bucks County has now gone a little bit blue, but for the last 50 years, it's the rule has basically been wherever Bucks goes, Pennsylvania goes, and wherever Pennsylvania goes, the election goes. So when I was in high school, CNN was coming to the diners in my hometown to interview people. They were doing that story there. So I have friends and family all across the political spectrum, cops, firefighters, teachers who are diehard Trump supporters, and, people have started businesses and work in liberal arts and are college professors who are diehard, dyed in the wool Democrats. I see those people interact with each other. I've watched how much worse those interactions have gotten over the years. And I think one of the biggest changes has basically been that they've stopped communicating and participating in the conversations with the people directly in their community. And they're doing it mostly online. They're doing it through media. They're understanding what the other side's saying through the, conservative or liberal bented press that's telling them what the other side's saying. So, everybody on the left is just seeing nonstop Marjorie Taylor Greene, and everybody on the right's just seeing nonstop AOC. And you're just taking from the people who are kind of, more fringe politicians and characterizing them as representative of the whole other group. And we don't do enough of the community stuff anymore. I remember a time when my dad, who is very liberal, would sit around with a friend of his who was really conservative, and they'd have a beer and scream at each other and argue and laugh and slap each other on the back and have it out. And that just doesn't happen anymore in the climate we're in. And so I always tell people, for me, that's like the biggest thing, the lowest hanging fruit that I think we could pursue is just real in-person conversations where you go into it with an open mind. And I have a lot of thoughts and tips about how exactly to do that, but I think doing it in the first place is a really important step.
And what's fun about doing that work? Well, I agree with you. People don't do it. It's hard. It takes time. It's much easier to sit in a vacuum and to agree with people or hate on people, whatever you prefer to do. But when you sit down with someone and share your story, your own background, most people are, even people like take an issue like abortion. People on the left and the right oftentimes are coming at their opinion, even fringe, from some experience or some perspective. And oftentimes they're not that different. They end up with a different conclusion. But their background and their story, it's easier to understand how someone got to their conclusion when you understand their background, where they came from, their family dynamics, all these different things. But that takes work. And it's much easier to just go on and have a quick social media interaction and pat yourself on the back and say, I'm right. See, these people that I've never met say I'm right. I'm right. And when you sit down and have a conversation with someone who's really different than you, you find out that you have a lot in common. And that's scary.
Yeah, it's scary and it's illuminating, and it challenges a lot of your, preconceived notions about how the world works and who these people are. And, I'll just say one tip that I use that always comes up in my personal life because, people find out I'm a political reporter. And so if they have any kind of remote interest, they either go like, oh my God, I feel horrible for you, or they are somebody who's politically engaged and they immediately want to start, peppering me with questions. What do I think about this story, that story, the things that have happened? And my rule is always that I try and ask 3 questions before I say anything about what my opinion is or get on my soapbox or share my view. So even if somebody's just like, oh my God, I saw Donald Trump was at this rally and, can you believe that he said that? I'd be like, oh, I don't know. Have you ever been to a Trump rally before? Do you have like family members who are Trump supporters? Just like start there and just get the person talking about their views. Because for me, it's not about manipulating the conversation in any specific way. It's that I want to understand the people who I'm talking to more than I want to hear myself talk. I know how I feel and what I think and all the stuff I have. I'm really interested in like why this person feels this way. Why do they suppose I might feel a certain way because of whatever they know about me or have heard about me? And that is always the most illuminating parts of those conversations is, hearing how people are thinking about the news, hearing what kinds of stories are coming down from the media pipeline and that are really salient with people on the ground. And I often learn from people. I mean, I learn from my readers, I learn from my listeners who write in to argue with me and, make the case about, what's happened to them, their own personal experience. Uh, we all know very little, much less than we like to think we do. And so, I think the more questions you can ask and the more you can do to just hear people and actually with intention listen to what they're trying to tell you, the easier it's going to be to sort of communicate in those situations where you're talking with somebody who you might really have strong disagreements with.
It's a great tip. And I told you before we even started recording that I wanted to have the conversation around the kind of flip your script mentality when it comes to how we talk about politics, how we think about media, how we think about the media landscape and bias and that sort of thing. Do you think it's necessary? I mean, obviously you started Tangle, but can we do this? Can we collectively kind of flip the script from the media's bias? I'm only going to pay attention to people who are like me. We're going to have some sort of insurrection, protest, riot, whatever side of that you're on as we go into the next election cycle that we're in? Or do you think we can actually do it? Can we get back to having these healthy conversations, or have we moved into a new time?
I will give you my kind of optimistic pitch, which is just that I think that we've hit rock bottom. I mean, I think January 6th and most of the election fighting stuff that happened post 2020, and then just the realization of who we have back on the table as our options for 2024 has gotten a huge chunk of the country to this feeling of just foreboding. Like, I can't believe we're here again. This can't be the best two people we can come up with. And, also, I am tired of being exhausted. I'm tired of being engaged on this stuff. I'm tired of the outrage cycle. I mean, I know what I see on the news and I know what I see on social media, but when I talk to people, when I talk to my friends, my family, it doesn't matter whether they're old or young, educated or not, working class or white collar job or Democrat, Republican, everybody is just like so tired of all the noise and the back and forth and the constant freakouts and the rage cycles. I mean, literally everybody that I talk to feels that way. And it's a very diverse group of people, politically, ideologically, racially, who I'm interacting with. And that to me is a really strong signal that there's just a lot of people out there who kind of want to reset, who are interested in something a little different. I don't think it's an accident. Somebody like Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is polling at 15% in some polls in the country right now. I think there's a real strong hunger and thirst for just like anything but what we have. So I view that as an opening. I think this situation we're in now was created by a lot of the failures of mainstream media and by a lot of the people like the TV pundits you spoke about who I think thrive on the rage cycle, who are interested in keeping people angry and keeping them mad at each other and divided. And that's really profitable and good for them. And so the longer that I've been in this space, the more I'm seeing, other news outlets with a similar ethos as ours pop up, other nonprofit organizations trying to get into the space, just like normal Americans who are really interested in third parties or, reforming our election systems, doing something to just kind of change the paradigm. So, my hope, my fervent wish is that after this election, we can get to a place where there is kind of this real hunger for a reset. I think the next 6 months are going to be awful, candidly. I don't have a great message about that, but I do think that once this election is over and there's kind of a guarantee that, our two main political figures are going to be different in the following election for sure, at least one of them, that's gonna kind of give everybody an opportunity to open the door to some fresh thinking and new approach to this. And yeah, I think it's possible. It's not going to happen overnight. It'll be a long process, and there's going to be a lot of people who are interested in making sure it doesn't happen. I mean, a lot of people benefit from the divide. They benefit from really strong partisan feelings on one side or the other. So, we have to be careful of those people and identify them and, you know, be big tent and bring them into the big tent, but also just recognize where they're coming from. But yeah, I think it's possible. I'm not optimistic we're going to see it happen immediately, but I think there are going to be a lot of opportunities for it in the near future.
And it starts kind of where this whole conversation began, which is, entrepreneurs. You see an opportunity in the market, and then you say, "Oh, I think maybe I've got a solution. I don't know if other people want it, but I want it." And I totally agree with you that that's sort of where we are as a country, because I have friends on all sides of, and people who work here, all sides of the political spectrum. And everyone does have this sort of collective, I wish we had a different candidate. I wish we had a different option. This just exhausted distaste. And when that collectively happens, then it is an opening for something new to kind of sprout up, because I think not everyone, many people, I would say the majority of the country feels like, boy, no one really represents me. And that is such an opportunity, because will there be a third party? Will there be the birth of something new? Even if you talk to a Reagan Republican, it might not be a Trump Republican, because even the term Republican sort of means something different now. And you mentioned, the fringe on both sides. So again, I'm with you, but I'm an optimist. I'm hopeful that it will take us to get to where we are for everyone to say, boy, maybe it's time to rethink. Maybe it's time to rethink, because my personal biggest fear is that people disengage. And I see that happening where people are, oh, what a mess, I'm out. And there's a person who I talk with every couple of weeks. It's sort of my check-in on sort of how many people in the public are, which is this young woman. She's a Gen Zer, gets all of her information from TikTok. All of her information, because she's can't with the rest of it. And if you're not following legitimate news sources on TikTok, and you're following just pundits or people with opinions on TikTok, you're not getting any fact. You're getting just straight up opinions. And to have a whole bunch of people voting based on TikTok that isn't coming from people who are doing the hard work, you're doing the 10 hours, 12 hours a day, it's concerning. But I think there's more people out there that want something better and will invest the energy and intellect to doing better. And that's exactly the path that you're on. And when people see you and Tangle having success, it's an opening for someone else to say, hey, maybe I could do something and make money. Because if you're doing what you're doing and not making money, that would be the end of what you're doing.
Yeah, no, totally. I mean, one of the things that I'm really proud of is that we have a successful business model, and we've proven that you could build a sustainable, profitable, lucrative media outlet without just playing into people's worst base fears. And I don't think there are enough people out there doing that yet. And I really, really hope, as much as I don't want a ton of competition in the space because that's scary for me, I also really want competition in this space. Like I feel strongly that there's enough demand that other people could pursue a similar ethos that we're pursuing and do really well and succeed. And I think you're starting to see those people pop up and, similar outfits pop up. And to me, that's encouraging. It's just representative of the demand. And, the market's huge. I mean, there's close to 400 million Americans, 300 million who are probably, 200 million who are probably politically engaged and care. And, on top of that, there's a huge global population that really cares about what's happening here. I mean, we have readers right now in over 60 countries outside the US, and they care. I mean, I have people from Canada, Australia, India, who write in passionately about a congressional race that's happening in Colorado, because it matters for them, because our politics and our policy sort of impacts the whole planet. And I think a lot of Americans kind of lose sight of that. I certainly don't know any Americans that are, tracking a state election in Australia because they're worried about what might happen. And the reality is we have a really big impact and people really care. And so I think there's a huge global audience who's interested in, a more even-handed, balanced kind of news approach that exposes them to a really wide range of arguments.
And I think it's the reason that so many Americans are interested or following the BBC. I 5 years ago wasn't paying a lot of attention to what the BBC was putting out there because, well, maybe 10 years ago, because it still felt like there was options sort of here. And now sometimes the BBC's take on things happening in the US is for as far as like mainstream television, oftentimes is the least biased. It's the most just, I'm like literally looking at it from this other lens and just here are the facts, because they really don't have, I mean, you could argue that they do have a dog in the fight, but to some degree, their dog in the fight is getting readers and listeners and viewers. So, and to some degree that's exactly what you're talking about having happen here in the US is let's just put out the information for people to consume and they can make their own decisions. And by the way, once you make an informed decision based on fact, or even if it's just straight up emotional, bring a beer to the neighbor, talk about it, have a conversation instead of an argument.
Yeah, totally. I mean, like I said, I think we need more of that more than anything else right now. And that's kind of, to me, that's the real lowest hanging fruit out there for us.
Okay, will you make any predictions? 6 months from now, what is your headline going to be? What do you think? The morning after the election?
I mean, my general perspective right now is that, first of all, a lot can happen in 6 months. And I don't mean to, that's not a dodge at all. I'm going to answer your question, but just a quick reminder for people that, in 2016, the Access Hollywood tape came out 2 weeks before the election. And, a week before that, James Comey released the report on Hillary Clinton saying that he was reopening the investigation into her emails. I mean, these things completely changed the shape of the race. We have right now, I think, a really close presidential race. Everything that I've seen from the polls would suggest that Donald Trump has a slight edge. I respect the work of pollsters, and I think that actually the polls have generally been better in the last 8 or 10 years than maybe people acknowledge. Everybody likes to kind of point out all the polls that were wrong and criticize the pollsters. They've actually been pretty solid if you take the polls that we had, a couple of weeks before the election. Democrats have basically won every single election that's been competitive handily since January 6th, and even more so since Roe v. Wade. If you force me to bet all my belongings on who is going to win the presidential race right now, I would bet Joe Biden, mostly because I think Democrats are in a much stronger position on the issue of abortion, which has been really salient. I think Biden still is going to be the preference for most moderate and kind of independent-minded Republicans, even if they hate voting for him and think he's really old and whatever else. I think Donald Trump, basically since January 6th, has not done anything to improve his reputation with voters who are kind of in the middle. And all he's really had is a bunch of criminal cases since then, and trials and drama around whether he's going to court or mishandled classified documents or whatever else. And regardless of how you feel about those cases, and I know some people think they're political witch hunts and all that, there are average voters who have 15 minutes to care a day. And those are the kinds of things they're seeing. And I think they don't want, that nothing about that has improved his standing with them. So I think Democrats are in a stronger position nationally. I think Biden is in a stronger position versus Trump. I think we'll see a lot of Democratic voters come home as the election gets closer. All of that, of course, barring some huge political controversy, another war breaking out, President Biden having a major health crisis. I mean, there's tons of different things that could happen between now and the election. But despite the polling, I would say I think Biden's in a stronger position. And I say that just because Democrats keep winning. I mean, they've won basically every important race since 2016. And I don't know why that would change now. I don't think the fundamentals haven't changed since.
Thank you for answering the question. And if you're an American with 15 minutes to care, this is exactly the reason that you should subscribe to the newsletter, listen to the podcast, and get more content from Isaac, because what he just did is what you get. It's, well, it could be this or it could be this, but maybe it's this. And then you get to kind of decide if you do or don't agree, but you feel how you can do politics in an unbiased way. And the way that you laid all of that out, I think, is exactly what I found in reading your newsletter, is that it's fact-based. It's a little, there's some gut base, this is sort of what I see if I'm reading the tea leaves, but I'm going to tell you when I'm reading the tea leaves. I'm going to tell you when it's not fact-based, because this is what I've seen based on trends. So thank you for answering the question and kind of highlighting how someone can answer a question like that in a way that doesn't feel like you're wrong, I'm right. Your guy sucks, my guy sucks less, which is pretty much kind of the conversations that are happening in many circles. So thank you for coming on the podcast and sharing your perspective and helping me get the Flip Your Script Media important conversation that we need to have, because we can share stories in a way and make meaningful connections with people, even in the midst of a political year. And after all of that, Isaac, the last question that I ask everyone on the podcast, do you have a quote that you would like to share with us?
I do. I appreciate you gave me a heads up before we hopped on, and I had a minute to think about it. And I always screw it up, so I want to read it to make sure I don't screw it up. This is one of my favorite quotes ever, though, and it's very closely related to Tangle, which is that wisdom begins when you discover the difference between that doesn't make sense and I don't understand. And I think that is an approach that I have to the media and to a lot of people's worldviews that I try and employ on a daily basis. Is, there is a huge difference between that doesn't make sense, this person is crazy, yada, 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 and I simply don't understand why they feel this way, what's happening, what the real story is. And I try and hold that a lot when I write and report and think about the news and the world we're living in.
It's a great quote, great point. And as this podcast, we just had our 4-year anniversary. And I think that exact thing is what has changed in me personally, because as a trained journalist, you're not supposed to have bias, but of course you do. And I was a lot more binary in my thinking. And over the course of hearing people from all walks of life share their stories, share their perspective, share their journeys, share their struggles, share their successes, it has made me just a better thinker who considers the backstory of people who I fundamentally disagree with. Because the reason I'm approaching something passionately, they've got the exact same passion. It's just coming from a different place. And once we can get to the source of where that is passion's coming from, then it's a connection and it's a conversation and a community. So thank you for sharing all of this with the listeners.
Thanks for having me on, Kristi. I appreciate it.
What a great conversation for the podcast. And the Flip Your Script challenge this week, pretty easy. Next time you meet someone who has a difference of opinion than you, ask them 3 questions. Before you answer, ask 3 questions, get curious, try to approach things with a curiosity mindset instead of a mindset of I'm going to change your mind. And if you're spending a lot of time in the chat rooms and hating or finding people to agree with you online, have a face-to-face with someone. It can really change your perspective. My hope is Isaac's story empowers you to believe you're capable of more than you think, to discover motivation, to uncover inspiration, and to find the strength to turn the page.